My name is Marty Hilton, and I'm president of Architecture Sarasota. A critical part of our mission is to support good design that addresses critical issues impacting the Sarasota region and beyond. These issues include affordable housing, coastal resilience, and sustainable urban development that embodies the aspirations of the community while retaining its character and sense of place. Architecture Sarasota is pleased to launch Downtown Sarasota, Hindsight, Insight, and Foresight, a 4-part speaker series conceived to spark a community-wide dialogue about the future of downtown Sarasota. Sarasota is experiencing a period of rapid growth and transformation. Here at Architecture Sarasota, we believe this series will provide a forum for residents, stakeholders, and community members to come together to understand better how we got where we are, what's happening now, and how Sarasota might evolve in the decades to follow. Renowned experts Andre Stwani, David Hull, Mitchell Silver, and Victor Dober will address vital topics including Sarasota 2020, the current master plan and how it was developed 2 decades ago, the macro level and local forces impacting the development of downtown, case studies from other locations, and best practices for urban planning and design. The 4th and final installment is Victor Dover, founding principal of Dover, Cole & Partners, a firm that emphasizes the use of new urbanist principles in developing sustainable downtowns and master plans. Mr. Dover will examine the special opportunities and distinct challenges of urban development in a Florida context and explore how to put together meaningful downtown master plans. Founding principal of Dover, Cole & Partners, Victor Dover is nationally recognized as an innovator in city planning, neighborhood design, and street design. He has led more than 200 charrettes. Victor lectures widely around the world on topics of livable communities and sustainable development and has served as the national chair of the Congress for New Urbanism. He co-authored the breakthrough book, Street Designs, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. Victor has been awarded the John Nolan Medal for contributions to urbanism, is a fellow of both the American Institute of Certified Planners and the Congress of New Urbanism, and is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Miami. Victor also serves as president of the Parks Foundation of Miami-Dade and as a board member of the National Recreation and Parks Association. With that, please help me in welcoming Victor Dover.
Marty, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Well, I am deeply honored to be invited for this, partly because others in the series are some of my oldest friends and mentors, and I'm sort of humbled by the idea of following hard acts to follow, like Andres Duani and Mitchell Silver, who've been my teachers, and I hope I do it justice. Now, a few years ago, county planning director in one of those meetings where I was needling him with lots of questions because I'm a professional question asker, troublemaker. He finally, in frustration, turned to me and just said, "Victor, we can't plan it yet because we don't know what's going to happen." And that is a true story. And it hit me like a bullet. I'm never going to forget that moment because I realized that he had forgotten that we get the places we actually devise, the ones we decide to have, the ones we give ourselves permissions to build. So great cities do not, as it turns out, come from Santa Claus or from the Easter Bunny. They come from doing hard stuff like sitting down together and disagreeing politely until you can find common ground and drawing lines on a map and saying, let's make Main Street like this, not like that. And you have this long tradition here of doing that in different ways, in different forums, in different formats, and in different decades. But what you're all enjoying about the city that you have is a direct result of that effort that your ancestors gave. So in a few overall themes I'll have to cover here. One of them is, although I'm a planner, I'm also an urban designer, I want you to remember you heard me say this. Design, as it turns out, is not something extra that you can add on at the end after all the big decisions have been made by the lawyers and the traffic engineers and whoever. It's actually a thing that has to be part of your process from the beginning to end up with a place that people will love. So first, a little test. And I'm going to call on Ann and Liz and some of you on the front row here with this question. Think for a moment, just close your eyes and think. What are the biggest things you own? We all value the small things we own. We carry small things around with us in our pockets for which the design matters a lot, right? But switch the scale. What are the biggest things you own? Ann? Name one. Name one of the big things you own. A house. Most people think of that right away. I thought of that the first time I heard this question. I learned this from a friend in Denver. What else? A car, Esther. Name a big thing you own? A car, yeah. Or your refrigerator. Or, you can think of objects, the big things you own. As it turns out, these are really huge, but they're very small compared to the biggest things you own, because the biggest things you own are the shared public components of your physical city. And not just the big library and the big cultural institutions or the big state university that you partly own or what have you, but your streets and public spaces. And arguably your streets are the most important and certainly the largest of your public spaces. And you own them just like you own your house or your car or your refrigerator. So think about that as we work together through some examples. Now I promise, show some pictures of Sarasota, but I am doing it mainly to get you thinking outside what you're used to. Because when you become accustomed to a place, or even in love with a place because of what you see every day in that place, it can become hard to forget that it wasn't always like that, and that it could, for good or not so good, be different in the future, depending on the decisions that are made by you and on behalf of you. So we'll think about that a bit. Now, as an urban designer, I often say I have the best job in the world. We're kind of in the before and after business. We take people from the place that they know and help them figure out what they want their town to be like when it grows up. And we make a lot of before and after pictures. By the way, that one's not a simulation. That's a little street in South Miami that was our first street design project. I call it the street in South Miami that got us permission to get out of South Miami every once in a while. But the before and after of the place that you know, reimagined. Like if it's a place that, as it turns out, was a temporary, brittle, not so flexible thing that had a short economic usable lifetime. You have to imagine when it comes time to replace it, what you could replace it with, you might have more loyalty for, that you might want to see get better and better as it grows and changes, as opposed to just wishing it would go away. I'm getting a little bit of lag, Chris. I don't know if I'm doing it wrong. Sticking my hand out seems to help. Okay. So we make a lot of pictures. We make all kinds of pictures, drawings and freehand drawings and watercolors and computer simulations and what have you, to illustrate the places that people know and that they're used to, they assume will never change, turning into some other kind of place and what it might be like. And that visualizing change before it occurs is a recurring theme in this work. Why bother to go making all these pictures? It's because of this. Americans, pause. Marty said, keep it nonpartisan. This is nonpartisan. Americans, we're so divided, are conditioned to be suspicious of growth and change. We have learned from the conditioning of built experience all around us to expect that, at least with the default settings, growth and change are going to make things worse rather than better. We can all remember some pasture that turned into a used car lot, or we can remember some cornfield that turned into an office park or a subdivision. We can probably also remember a great old neighborhood that declined in some way. And so change is a scary thing. And our job is to illustrate to one another the various ways we could evolve so that growth and change could make things better rather than worse. That as we, in the natural course and order of things, got bigger, we may actually become more charming as a community or as a neighborhood or as a street. It's possible. And I think our job, and by that I mean your job, is to restore citizen and leader confidence in the idea that growth and change can make things better rather than worse. That is the number one obstacle, and that is the thing that we draw a lot of pictures for. Now, I did find out what the answer is. Back that up one. There we go. There we go. Thank you, Chris. Last week in The Economist, the headline says that the key to the whole thing is just having the quality of life that means you can go downstairs out of your dwelling or your desk or your hotel room and enjoy some of the basic comforts of city life, like walking to a neighborhood coffee shop. They interviewed people of all ages and all incomes and interests and educational attainment levels in all kinds of places geographically, and they come down to the basic same thing, that people want a kind of gentle and agreeable mixed use. They'd like to be able to enjoy that simple thing. Have you ever heard of a NORC? Any of the real estate people? N-O-R-C? A NORC is a naturally occurring retirement community. It is the thing in the marketplace that makes the purveyors of the artificially occurring retirement community very nervous competitively, because the NORC offers people the ability to walk downstairs and walk down the street and get fresh fruits and vegetables, or see a neighbor, or get their hair done, or maybe even visit their optometrist without having to drive on big, scary roads to do it. And it's not too hard to figure out how to make a place that has those city comforts. Now, some of this is about time. And architectural time is like geologic time. It happens very, very slowly. I've been coming in and out of Sarasota for maybe the last 35 years, every 4 or 5 years. The first time was when Frank Folsom Smith, one of your neighbors, invited me to come here and participate in an AIA event. So I've been observing, especially downtown, but I've been going away and coming back. And so I can actually see the change quite vividly, especially over the last 20 years. Now, Americans, for all our faults and divisions, have actually historically been very good at this town-making stuff. And I use Savannah as an example because it's a source of encouragement to us. And people go to Savannah and its National Landmark Historic District, which is vast. And they enjoy the street scenes of those beautiful live oak lined streets with row houses facing them. They enjoy the squares, the spot where the bench was, where Forrest Gump was eating the chocolates, that's the spot. And they love it there. And to some of them it occurs, why couldn't we have this at home? Why don't we build this when we go back to our town? But what I want you to understand about Savannah is that when General Oglethorpe founded the town and was ripping the town out of the wilderness and pushing back mosquitoes and snakes and angry natives and floods, around the time when that drawing was made, it was basically a single-family detached house, large lot subdivision. Those lots, each with a cabin on it, surrounded the squares, and you can see it, you can make it out. Actually, there's one of the squares, here's another, here's another. So the initial genius of the Savannah plan, which later grew larger, was there from the very beginning. And Oglethorpe understood, and Savannah understood, that over time, they would do more with those lots. They would subdivide them. They would tear down the old cabin, basically, and build a permanent house, or build 3 or 4 row houses where the first house existed. And you can see examples of that right here. Here's one of those squares. This little spot here is identified in the legend as Mr. Oglethorpe's tent. I thought that was pretty great. You have a map that says, here's the man in the tent. He's taking care of the plan and looking after its implementation on site. Basically, the planning director. Is Steve Cover here with us? That's Steve. So now you probably all know the story of the Savannah College of Art and Design, not something that people prior to the middle of the 20th century ever imagined would be founded, revitalizing Savannah's historic district. And those row houses in many cases were subdivided again into flats over flats, 3 stories, and one in the carriage house and what have you. So by the time you take a house or a cabin off a lot and you replace it with 3 row houses, and then you subdivide the 3 row houses over time into 3 floors plus a carriage house of 4 to 5 elegant units overlooking one of those squares, you are now at something like 12 times the original density of the town when they were settling it. Wait, that's why Savannah is worth visiting. The density means that because there are enough souls around to support it, you can have local commerce, coffee shop again, and you can have local congregations, and you can have local businesses. So that the culture of a city is that kind of culture. It's bringing enough souls together for our conveniences. And we've been doing this for a long time, 3,500 years very formally, 5,000 years informally of human experience in town making. So we've gathered up some examples over the years of what works better and not so well. And what seems to last despite changes in our technology or our businesses or our institutions. There are a lot of ways you can look at a city. So I have a little list here of my favorite lenses. These are not the only lenses you can use, of ways of thinking about it. So look at the second column from the left, the machine view. This essentially views the city in the way that an engineer does. The city for it is utilitarian, right? We come together in community because it's better for our collective security, right? And we come together because we want to have commerce and make these exchanges with one another. And because we're social beings, we want to be with other people. And we tend to be in the places that people love being because we like watching people and we like the same places they do. But the utilitarian view or the engineering view of a city is like it's a big machine. It has pipes and wires and utilitarian requirements. You want the traffic signals to change from red to green at the time when they're supposed to, even if there's a roundabout at the same intersection. And you want the toilets to flush when they're supposed to. You want the storm water to make its way off the land and without flooding your streets for too terribly long after a storm. So these are the productive and wired mechanical lenses that we use to judge whether a city is working or not. But of course, there's not a lot of inspiration in that. Go to the far right. Thinking of it like a bunch of data points is the way an economist or an accountant would look at a city. You know, how much money does it make? How many transactions are we making? What are the sales per square foot in those retail establishments? Is it recognized as a product? Are there a lot of indicators that the trend is good, like resales and so sales per square foot that I mentioned, or other indicators like are our customers increasing in their level of educational attainment? Now you can still keep going with data and find other things. Are we actually expanding the organic range of incomes and households? Are we getting to more diversity over time or less? You can analyze what's happening to our ages and so on. But the economist and the accountant recognize that that's a dynamic system. You change a variable, it changes everything else, right? So that's another set of lenses that you can use. Now, let's take on the far left, let's take the example of the lenses a wildlife biologist would use. You know, this is human habitat. Hey, Mitchell. They observe us in our natural habitat, the city or town or neighborhood. The wildlife biologist wants to see how well it sustains our life, how well we're able to find a mate, how well we're able to procure food, probably because we come to the same watering holes that our food does. So, you know, think of let's say, watering hole in the African savanna in the National Geographic documentary. The wildlife biologist measures that thing they can put a number on called species richness. And that means the biodiversity in that place is greatest. As it turns out, a city is like that too. Our cities tend to be highest performing and most resilient when they also have a lot of species richness. Not everybody of the same size household, not everybody in the same age household, not everybody in the same income. But also you can turn that to the businesses, not just big ones, but big ones and small ones and medium-sized ones. Not just big institutions, but small and scrappy ones and informal ones as well as formal ones. But the whole idea is that just like all those different kinds of animals come to the watering hole in the savannah to nurture their young and to find food and so on and water, we come to the city to find those things we need in the city. So it becomes our preferred habitat. See how that works? Now there's a fourth set of lenses that I want to talk about. Then I'll be done with this long slide. And that's the lens of the artist. As it turns out, the city is all the things I just described, but it's also a collective work of art that is never finished. It's the result of a great ongoing collaboration. People who are all working on it in their own way, making their timely upgrades, adding to it, changing it, painting on top, blurring the lines of what was done before, and the layers under their canvas. And it's never finished. In fact, these collaborators may never know one another. They may not be in the same room. They may not live in the same century or have the same job. But when we think of the city as a great collective work of art, first of all, you realize immediately that design matters, because without the specialness that comes from design magic, it won't be inspiring. It won't be intentional. It won't grab you. And that is the key to success. That the city that people really love is the one that makes them think. It's the one that is a good place for exchanging ideas, the one that tests them a little bit, the one that communicates. So with all those lenses, what's a city for? It's for a lot of things. And I would suggest as you start to renew your plans and make updates and timely upgrades to your city plans, but you always start with that question: what's our city for? What are we for? What's it for? If you arrive after some discussion that it's not just for zipping back and forth from far-flung houses across someone else's neighborhood in the event of a hurricane evacuation or otherwise. It's really not just for getting together and selling each other stuff, although it is for that. What the city is really for is to support human flourishing. The young ones, the old ones, and the in-between. That's what it's for. And we do that by supporting our businesses and by supporting our households and by supporting our institutions with their physical containers. That's what we design. We're designing an architecture, a building, we're doing that. We design a street or a block or a neighborhood, we're also doing that. This is the thing that makes a city beloved. And it's also the city that makes its brand transcend the long lists of peer cities and become uniquely recognized like yours is. If I say Paris, just as an evocation of a brand name, if I evoke Paris, you immediately got a mental picture, whatever it might be. You might have imagined the Eiffel Tower, you might have imagined a sidewalk cafe or an impressionist painting. It doesn't matter. Paris is a thing that has a mental picture in your brain. It's like saying Kardashian. It's a celebrity, right? And so that story that we get, a visual and otherwise, that story that we get in our brains about a city's designed culture is a result of somebody making decisions. Let's do it this way or draw it that way, not this other way. But it's also the key to economic success. It's how you remain competitive. Quick, Toledo. Sorry, Toledo. I just picked you at random, I promise. All right, so I have spent the last couple of days walking back and forth around your whole town. Actually, I got the Howard Davis forced baton death march all over town. We wore out the soles on our shoes, got new shoes, went back out. It was great. And I'm a experienced pedestrian. Okay, I'm South Miami's most notorious jaywalker. That's my other title. And so I think I might have made Howard a little nervous by standing in the middle of the road to take pictures. But if you want to line up on the steeple, you got to get out in the middle of the road at times. But walking around with a camera is useful because we kind of grab a piece of the world and bring it back into the room with us. But what did I see? I saw all of these little indications of people adding little gifts to your daily experience in architecture and in urbanism. And some of them are really obvious. The ornament on a building, or that extra effort that went into terminating a vista, or anchoring a corner with an architectural flourish, let's call it. And if you see me do that, you can press the button back there. And there we go. Okay. And I observed some other things that there were a lot of older buildings and newer buildings which had in common a very high quality. There were, I will also say, a great many middle-aged buildings were not so great. And what that tells you is that the city had a design culture in John Nolan's 1920s, and it has a design culture now that has been reinvigorated and is going strong. I'm not saying everything's perfect, but a lot of the new buildings are excellent. They're first quality. Not every one and not every piece of every building, but you can definitely see that there's a way here. There's a common language that's being spoken by some of the architects. There were other observations we made, like the slenderness of some of the best in the oldest and newest buildings. The old Terrace Hotel, which is, I think, used as storage now. I don't know, but that needs a user. But as a feature on your skyline, the slenderness of that tower, which any developer will tell you is a very inefficient floor plate. Okay, inefficient floor plates become possible, by the way, at high prices per square foot and high prices per unit. So you became eligible again to do slender buildings in recent times. And the one on the right, another example. And it's hard to feel the same affection for the battleship length buildings. And I think that's just an interesting topic to raise as you get into the discussion of your next plan, how you're going to encourage more of what you want and less of what you don't. It's hard not to fall in love with the remaining historic buildings from especially the 1920s. The Sage restaurant, a little dark in this picture, was an example of that. But they aren't all as elaborate as that one. This is a very simple, old-style Florida apartment building, probably originally 4 or 5 units. Just having a nice building-to-street relationship and a little bit of extra in the stucco along the parapet, but nothing really elaborate. And it's just very agreeable. And so everywhere we looked on the march, we found examples of this. Buildings are just neighborly because you feel very comfortable on the sidewalk in front of a building that has this kind of building-to-street relationship. What Jane Jacobs called eyes on the street. She meant doors and windows and balconies and storefronts and porches as the features down in these lower levels of the building that are greeting you at the street. And speaking of neighborly, I have to do this a few times just to keep your sense of humor up. They're just unedited pictures of Sarasota, but the caption here would be, which one of these is more neighborly to you? And find a few examples of that. This is a pretty phenomenal building. I think you're lucky to have had it survive this long, given the pressures, pressure. And so we found a lot of places where there's just juxtaposition of the neighborly and the not so neighborly, right? And it will be interesting to see how you sort that out over time. There are practical considerations, like for example, in the areas that are affected by the FEMA flood maps and require elevated finished floors on the ground levels, like this hotel. At times we find artful solutions for that. It's not perfect, but the front of this hotel and the corner of this hotel resolving the difference in level between where they're allowed to put the floor in light of the storm surge risk and the street level, with a combination of terraces and landscaping and clever geometry, they turned it into actually just a very pleasant place to be. Taken as a slice of life, it looks like a little piece of a cantilevered Garden of Eden. And And not bad, right? Pretty effective. And I found a lot of examples where someone had taken the extra trouble from the edge of the building envelope out to greet the street to resolve that. I found examples where they did not do so. And I know Andres said breeze and shade. This wasn't breeze. This was a wind tunnel in this location. But the extra effort it takes to resolve those difficult regulatory requirements pays off in a big way. This could have been like the shorefront in Saint-Tropez in the lowest levels, but it's not. And when it came around into the actual bayfront side, in the great crescent of John Nolan's plan for Sarasota, I wished for some of the artfulness that is on display out in front of the hotel. It's not too late, by the way. All these things can be retrofit and probably will be. So like every city, you have this tale of two cities. Sometimes you're on brand. The neighborly business, the neighborly house or apartment building that has this great building to street relationship. Sometimes you're not. And actually I heard this building is about to get replaced, and I thought, great, maybe when the new building comes and I stand there and wait, there will finally be a pedestrian in my photograph for the... But these are just across the street from one another who don't know this on Main Street, and one is a world that is one of those places where people want to be and one is not. So if you want to build more of a place that people value and more of a place where people want to be, you have to design it right. Does that make sense? Okay. So as we go along here, I'm going to take you on, I'll come back to Sarasota now and then, but I'm going to take you to some other places where they're working on exactly these things. How do we add to what was already there? Ever so gently. The old model for 1960s urban renewal was kind of a scrape off, slash and burn, tear it all down and then build some piece of the world of tomorrow. That's no longer the model and shouldn't be. Now the model is surgical. How do we add back more of what makes the place good? Maybe adding things that are denser than what was there before so that we can do more with less of the land. Sounds responsible, but not to lose everything that was there. Now there are places you can feel really good about retrofitting. And I want you to feel like you have a free hand from me, at least as far as I give you permission to retrofit a lot of the stuff in the suburban sprawl that surrounds the city. But I want to caution you to realize that built environment that's out there that I said didn't come from the Easter Bunny is actually a product of regulation and design. That people write rules, sometimes thinking about what they will generate and sometimes not, and people draw things. And that is what makes it turn out the way that it is. So when you see a place, you're probably looking at some combination of the designers and the developers' habits, or the engineer's standard detail, and what the rule book said they had to do to meet the minimum setbacks, the minimum parking requirements, the minimum and maximum impervious coverage or lot coverage and so on. So every place, including the ones that are charming and attractive and that add up to a lot of value, and the ones that fade quickly, is a result of that combination. I'll use an example from London to illustrate the point. This is a busy part of London. The BBC headquarters is on this block. There's traffic swirling around, black taxi cabs and so on. These fellows were standing on the street corner having a conversation. It struck me that the guy in the middle of the picture has his heels about 9 or 10 inches from the curb. He's not fearing for his life, even though it's a busy part of the town or anything. He's just having a conversation, exchanging ideas, or maybe talking about where to go to lunch. So let's examine the picture and see what it's got. First, somebody decided where the building goes on the property. Is it a setback or a build-to line? Somebody had to decide that. Someone set metrics that had to be complied with for the maximum height, the density in dwelling units per acre, the intensity in floor area ratio, and all these things. Somebody had to decide what the permitted land uses were that were allowed to go inside those buildings. It's allowed to be commercial or residential or offices or what have you. Someone had to decide what the parking requirements would be. Pro tip, spoiler alert, The parking requirements in this case are not the generator of the positive scene. Because they didn't push the building back an extra few hundred feet in order to put a parking lot in front of it, did they? And says the building that has the building to street relationship. Someone had to decide what the amount of glass was that were in the lower levels of the building. Would there be light spilling out from these buildings at twilight, or would it be dark when you walk by? And of course, architecture. And in Florida, unlike some of our other states, there are very strict limits placed upon us by the legislature about what we can or can't regulate as a local government when it comes to architecture. We can do quite a lot, especially in redevelopment areas and master plan communities, and when the developers are voluntarily subjecting themselves to architectural standards in order to get at other things. But in the generic, we're not allowed to do a lot. We can't, on a single family house in a neighborhood street, we can't any longer anyway regulate where they put the garage door. Legislature said, you can't be trusted with that. So they took that away. This scene is also the result of engineering manuals. Now I point to the bottom of the picture because if you can see it in that, can you see this or not? But the sidewalk is level. It's called a continuous sidewalk or a speed table or a tabled intersection. In this case, it's just the crosswalk. If you're a pedestrian, you have the priority, and it's very, very evident because it's level for you, including if you're in a wheelchair. And that's one of the reasons why the fellow standing so close to the curb isn't worried about it, because he knows that a car coming around this corner with its very narrow turning radius, by the way, is going to have to slow down. They're already on rough pavement. They're going to have to go up, cross, and back down again to get past that crosswalk. And that's not a maneuver they're going to want to make at high speed. So they make it at slow speed, and he feels safe because speed kills. Whether or not you can do something like that comes right down to, is there a page in the engineering manual that lets me do this? If there's not, it can be really hard to fight it. I can show you projects where the investors were willing to just take as long as necessary to get permission for doing the thing that wasn't in the book. Charles Brewer, the founder of Mindspring.com, so he was considered a genius because that was such a successful tech business, immediately declared himself a real estate developer. And he was pretty good at that too. And in Glenwood Park in Atlanta, a neighborhood that we designed for him, he fought for 2 years to get permission for the skinny streets and the street trees and the on-street parking and the small radii at the corners, rather than dumbing down his project. And that meant he spent a lot of time in City Hall, in the mayor's office actually, saying, aren't you sure, are you sure we can't do this? And eventually got to do it. These places are also the result of other practical day-to-day things, like can we get a fire truck there? Can we respond to an emergency there? Can we get the garbage in and out? Can somebody in a moving van bring their grand piano upstairs? All of those considerations. So why is that important? Because the foundation for getting all that right is in doing the plan, actually coming together as a community and deciding what you want it to be. And that here happened in an extraordinary way in the John Nolan plan. It may be, you're so used to hearing about it, John Nolan, 1923 plan, 1925? Yeah. Such a landmark of city planning, probably well publicized. I'm sure a lot of people evoke it, even if they're not really paying attention to what it said or showed. Well, you know, we're just doing just like John Nolan would have done. But the Nolan plan is really special, and it has some quirky geometry, especially in the center of the town, because he was reconciling that great crescent of the bayfront with the east-west, north-south grid of the body of the town, location of the rail depot, and so on. The result of those clashing geometries, let me zoom in on it a little bit. The result of that is that you get some quirky shapes to the lots, and probably that's produced a headache or two now and then. It also produces some other pretty wonderful things. This is what the technicians call a deflected vista. In retailing, you want a deflected vista. That's why in a shopping mall, they constantly turn the walkway as you go through it, because that tips storefronts and clear views to signage and merchandise into your field of vision. So if you want to make something seem special, you put it at the end of the street. And if the street keeps going, You go by it, and your vista, your view bounces off the building and goes that way. And there's a kind of energy that's set up by that. And you just inherited it. It's in the Nolan plan. So the street grid is rather special, and the artfulness with which that is done is generating a lot of results. People go to a lot of effort in planning for greenfield sites and in redevelopment planning for less inventive grids, figuring out how to bring wonder to the big dumb grid. And that is one of the ways. I'll show you an example from Oakland, California. Oakland labored for a long time as the secondary city of the Bay Area. Not great San Francisco or its neighbor Berkeley. It was Oakland. And Gertrude Stein coined that phrase, "There is no there," in reference to Oakland. And they've suffered from that reputation for a long time. Actually, Oakland has a lot of wonder to it. And it turned out, especially when rents were low enough to support this during a long period of decline and disinvestment, it supported a lot of creativity in small business and in the arts. It actually became a kind of culture hive for the Bay Area. Very interesting to see it. So we got to do the downtown specific plan. That's the California term for a downtown plan, and got to study all those developments that were known to be in the pipeline and predictions about the population growth over the coming era, what would come, and design in that plan. And in some ways, it's just a technical tool for analyzing the land use and transportation combinations that will need to make that work as housing and jobs grow into that area that's served with transit and so on. But it also revealed some other things. You see this yellow box? That's Interstate 980. Turns out that when you study the land use and transportation, you don't need Interstate 980. It wasn't really built to solve a transportation problem. It was built partly as a jobs program, generated a lot of jobs, got some federal money flowing over to California to dig a trench and build a street in it, and or a big highway in it. But it was also built as a divider. It was built to separate West Oakland, largely African American, at that time and before and since, from downtown. It was built as a moat. Let's be honest. And as it turns out, for transportation needs, you don't actually need it. So when Oakland finally started talking about what downtown meant and what their city was for, they started thinking maybe we should rethink that trench, this big gash across the city. And so what do you make a downtown plan for? Well, it's for whatever's important to you. So as Oakland has since found that their long period of low rent is long gone and rents are rising faster than incomes, what was important for them was somehow emphasizing equity and resolving a lot of the disparities that had developed in their community over the years. So their plan features that. So instead of just being a land use and transportation plan, you open the Oakland plan, it looks like an Oakland plan because it's got frank talk about the history of racial disparities and injustice, and every aspect of the plan is analyzed with regard to equity impacts. Well, that's the Oakland way, and that's what the Oakland plan has. And it also has that other stuff, like what are we going to build, where are we going to build it, how do we count it up, and decide where the greatest intensity should be, and how the land will meet the water, and so on. But the Oakland plan also gets at the culture keeping. And I put this here because of that. If I just mention an average Florida city, you don't think of it as a cultural center or hub, but you are. And that's partly because people that are in the arts and in culture are looking after it and adding to it year after year. Today, I had the pleasure of walking down an ordinary city street and hearing grand opera pouring out onto the sidewalk when they were rehearsing next door at the Opera House. Who else can do that? It's actually amazing. And I hope you're doing everything you can to protect that aspect of your plan. Certainly Oakland is. But I'll show you one more piece about 980. Now, you don't have an interstate crashing through your town. Why am I showing you this? It's to give you confidence that even those seemingly irreversible, gigantic, and terrible lurching spasms of concrete that we thought were fixed and can't change can be changed. And in Oakland, what the plan now is to take Interstate 980 out to build an at-grade boulevard and regrow the two neighborhoods of West Oakland and downtown Oakland back together again. And with the land that frees up to ensure that this area, even in a time of rising rents, remains mixed income and has green space when both are scarce and at a premium. So they decided what they wanted their plan to be, and they put that in their plan. And that's the story. As long as I'm tearing down lurching spasms of concrete. This was announced last night in Syracuse, New York. Mayor Walsh presented our plan for what's called the community grid, which is to take Interstate 81 down and replace and reconnect the street network where it was done. So this is one of the images of that. If you just want to make it vivid, I have to show you this picture. This is what it looks like from the street. That's the remnant of Almond Street underneath the interstate viaduct. I was in a hurry to take this picture and get out of there because pieces of this fall every day on the pedestrians down below. So it has to be replaced. And when they replace it, what they're going to replace it with is a great street in their town. Now, if they can do it, you can do it. And if they have to start with something really difficult, like an interstate, and all you have to worry about is Fruitville Road, you can do it. Okay. And these are just images that were from Mayor Walsh's presentation last night, showing the kinds of streets, public spaces, and yes, real estate opportunities that can be generated on the land that is currently smothered by this big concrete and steel dog collar around the neck of the town. Well, what about back here in Florida? Our neighbors just to the east in Lake Wales, on the Lake Wales Ridge, famous for Bok Tower, seen in the upper right-hand corner in the pictures, are probably about to see an onslaught of those of us from the Atlantic coast and those of you from the Gulf Coast all looking for someplace inland and a little higher to live. But of course, Lake Wales is blessed with a plan by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the Olmsted Brothers firm, which was a plan from 1925 to 1931 for planting lots of street trees, among other things. And so all we did in this visualizing change before it occurs stuff for Lake Wales to start with was just illustrate what that difference would be if they simply implemented that key idea from the Olmsted plan. But then, of course, you get down on the ground, there are more details. Like, for example, this historic building that had obviously been acquired by a stucco contractor. You know, you can tell from the window proportions and these little corner coins on the remnants of the architecture that there's a good historic building underneath here, right? But somehow, the occupants of that building, the owners at the time, were so afraid of the citizens of Lake Wales that they fortified themselves in this fortress. It's just amazing. So before and after, we created an illustration to show what it would be like when that building restores its building to street relationship. And that's under construction. So you'll have an after picture of that. That's a photograph before long. Let me take you to Chattanooga for an example. I'm on this issue of the big infrastructure can in fact be changed. Broad Street, which is the biggest street in town, is the main ceremonial street in the heart of downtown Chattanooga, ends very formally with the crystalline architecture of the Tennessee Aquarium at the top of the picture. And it's pretty good in some ways. In the 1970s, they planted some trees, some of whom are nearing the end of their life, not all. And that has made it greener than it used to be. But Broad Street is broad. It's a big, wide road. And so over time, they've done things like soak up a lane that they didn't really need in each direction and turn it into a bike lane. Does that sound familiar? People do it. They also did it a little clumsily, and they're thinking about how to change it. So where they are right now in Chattanooga is thinking through options. So the visualization was all the different ways we could use this big right-of-way. We could make a promenade street, like a La Rambla in Barcelona, with that, when we right-size the street for cars and maximize the space for pedestrians and trees. Here's a variation, which we call broader sidewalks, which is just simply moving from the outside in, adding extra tree lines and keeping the median in the center. That's the least ambitious version. And then there's an asymmetrical street, version. And the whole point of these pictures is to help let people try them on. Take a look, kick the tires, see what they like better or worse, better or worse. Kind of like at the optometrist's office, and they put that thing on your face, better or worse, better or worse. And as it turns out, the most radical of the solutions, which is the asymmetrical one, is the one that received the most public interest and acclaim. So that was fun to watch. So we've got a lot of things to do, designing for public health, designing for greenness, designing for value in particular. And I'll share with you, Mitchell Silver hinted at this, but I'm just going to dig in on it a little bit more. This is a street in greater Charleston, South Carolina, in a neighborhood called Ion. And actually, the plan was a joint effort of our office and Andres Duani's office many years ago. So we worked on this together. And it's, new greenfield neighborhood in the suburbs, but these houses in these street scenes don't look like the neighboring subdivisions. The neighboring subdivisions have the snout houses with the garage doors out in the front and the cul-de-sacs and so on. But in Ion, it all feels connected. There are sidewalks with street trees shading them, and the houses themselves, which vary quite a lot, are set a little more forward, and they stand a little more upright, and they're a little closer together. But fundamentally, there's nothing about the land use that's very different from the surrounding subdivisions. Now, our friend Joe Minicosi from Urban 3, mentioned by Mitchell, makes these amazing maps. This is the map I always show mayors, and where's Marlon? I show these to city managers. So this is the map y'all need to see. A spike map, where the spikes that stick up most tall are where there is the most annual property tax revenue generated on a per acre basis. And then in the upper left side of this is the beach. So naturally, that's the value from ocean views that the Almighty created. Not bad. And then in the center, and just to the right of the center at the top of the picture, is historic downtown Charleston. They've been building charm on top of charm for 350 years. So not surprisingly, that's where, on a per acre basis, the most value is generated. And on a map like this, the gray areas and the lighter purples are all creating more demand for services in dollars than they're generating in revenue to pay for those services on a per acre basis. And some of that you wouldn't want to touch. We don't want to mess with the marshes and the wetlands and the park and the university campus and some of the affordable housing and the nonprofit institutions and the religious organizations. So you need some of that. But if you're working to resolve the annual budget, or you're the school board superintendent and you're trying to figure out how to put tires on a school bus, or you're the parks director and you're trying to figure out how to put a good parks and recreation program together, you need some spikes in your town. And so really, I'm sure if we did the same analysis for Sarasota, we would see a big spike right here in the heart of town where the things are closest together and tallest and most beloved. And so that's a lens and a way of thinking about it. One of the things we have to do is design for value. To maximize that, but to also make it worth defending and loving, we need to make a place that has great experiences. You read in the Wall Street Journal about the so-called experience economy that we live in now. People choose this place or this venue or this lifestyle or this product because of the experience it brings as opposed to that one. And so designing a place where the experience is heightened and made more unique is exactly what we have to do. And here's the good news. Human beings have been doing that all over the globe for a really long time. You don't have to start from scratch, and you don't have to do it exactly the way they did it. It can vary quite a lot. Here's China compared to Rome. This is the Nanjing Road, which has its way of immediately being recognizable as compared to Piccadilly Circus, which has its immediate way of being recognizable. So these heightened experiences come from drawing them, from designing them. There are also everyday experiences to think about. Those city comforts I described. You see on the upper right corner of the picture, the apartments upstairs. If you live upstairs in one of those apartments, then you can come downstairs and walk down the block and buy fresh fruits and vegetables from this guy. I'm going to come back to this, but people have been able to do that for several hundred years in that location. So the accumulated value of that benefit to people. They didn't have to get in their car and drive somewhere to do it. Of course, that's an obvious version. But that is a very powerful experience to offer, one that folks are looking for in Norks and otherwise. I'll show you, just to show how dramatic the before and after pictures can be, I got to show you one more piece of Chattanooga. When we first got to the south side, it was 3 neighborhoods. They were called Rustville. I'm not kidding, that's the name of one of the neighborhoods. Fort Negley, which everybody called Fort Neglect, and Jefferson Heights. And they were linked together by Main Street. It's literally called Main Street. There it is on the right, Main Street. This place was a smoldering ruin. Everything that could have gone wrong to it had gone wrong to it. Chattanooga at that point was a Rust Belt city and a Sun Belt location. They were derided in the national press as the dirtiest little city in America. They had tragic racial divides, and the government made all of it worse with road building and slum clearance and slash and burn urban renewal, to the point where in the late 1990s, Main Street was entirely boarded up. And I don't mean kind of, sort of, partly boarded up. I mean every single building on Main Street was unoccupied on the ground floor and shuttered. And they said, "Can you fix this?" So, well, first, one of the things they had to get their minds around was the idea that they weren't going to be able to start with Main Street. They were going to have to start with some lower hanging fruit. We kind of invented a street that didn't quite connect. That was a couple blocks away, called 17th Street, and found ways to link it together. And they started building. This is a 1990s aerial photograph, and then here's one a few years later, where they started filling in the lost space in the town that they had inherited. They also planted trees. My friend, the great transportation engineer, Walter Kulash, called this a real street-like street. Just because it had street trees. And you had to go slow between the parked cars and around the little square at the end of the street. And then that set up an address they could surround with homes. And it's an architecture school town, so they got some mod. I thought, this is for you, Marty. So there you go. Primary colors, nice white palette. So some of it is mod, some of it is trad. They have good mod and they have odd mod. They have good trad and they have bad trad. But they're filling it all in. And they started sort of filling up the lost space. And then after a little while, they got the attention. Of course, the artists and the cyclists, the shock troops of urban revitalization, and the preservationists, and the philanthropies, the local foundations put a lot into kickstarting all of this. They started turning the lights back on in the historic buildings. The artists would climb in to those old rusty warehouses and next to the train tracks and drag stuff out and weld it together and make garden walls and fences. A building like this was renovated to be the best restaurant in Chattanooga. And so now the South Side is kind of a juggernaut. Actually, every time I pick up the paper, there's another announcement of a boutique hotel or more housing being filled in, new tensions between new and old, IT headquarters and things like that. So for me, this became a confidence building story, that if we could take something that was as hard, scrabble, and difficult as the South Side of Chattanooga, imagine what you could do when you start from a base of prosperity. You are challenged with a different question. What will you do with all this prosperity that you've got? You'll enjoy it, of course. You've got a lot of years to enjoy the wonder and good life that the city you already have affords you. But you're also going to, in this period of prosperity, which we know might not last forever, the one Nolan was on, the wave of prosperity he was surfing in the 1920s did not last. When the hurricanes in 1926 and 1927 and 28 came, and the boom went to bust. And the unthinkable happened to Florida to start the Depression several years early. in our state. No more of that prosperity available to do something with for quite a while. So if you're at the peak of your game, what are you going to do with all your prosperity? One of the challenges I would lay before you is, can you make street-oriented architecture? That blank wall issue that I talked about before is concerning. It seems like you're better than that. There's also something to the grain of construction. I think it might be driven not just by finance, but by parking. Looks to me like people are assembling sites that are large enough to get a big and efficient garage to satisfy their own and the government's parking requirements. And then, muscling out the size of the site until they get enough room to add real estate to the parking structure they have to build. That parking podium, which sometimes gets a little bit of architecture glommed on and other times gets a lot of architecture stuck on top of it, is a really poor way to start site planning. And you're not going to get the place you want from starting with the parking and then working your way out to everything else. So form follows parking is not the way to do it. But in the past, the way we did it was leveraging the power of lots and subdivision to take a block segment and to slice it like a salami in thicker and thinner slices, and then building bigger and smaller things according to the amount of land we had to do. That's the way great streets all over the country were built. That's Galena, Illinois. Here's Back Bay in Boston, which, by the way, was a big developer project from on reclaimed land in the late 19th century, subject to a strict form-based code and centered on street design. That's Commonwealth Avenue running through the middle of it. Here's another piece of Boston. What I want you to notice is that there are big buildings in these scenes, great big ones. It's just not every building that's huge and has the big footprint or the long frontage. There are also other buildings that are shorter, smaller, narrower, and so on. Now here's a modern example. This is an award winner, actually. It's not a bad project in many ways, but it's coarse-grained because what they did was start with those big garages that are in the middle of the block. They grouted up the center of the block with parking and then added architecture around the edges of it to create street scenes, better than not creating street scenes at all. But do you see the difference in the coarse-grained versus the fine-grained examples? I bet if we could figure out how to leverage the power of the small sites for infill that's lucrative, it would unlock a lot of value creation and wonder here. So that's what they did in traditional American towns, like this one, which is always voted America's famous favorite Main Street every year. So sometimes the great big thing is the one-off. It's the special, the monument, the landmark building. This is Barcelona. If you go out to the beach and you look over at the W Hotel, there's no mistaking its silhouette, but this is the Dubai grain, not the Barcelona grain. If we just turn the camera around and look the other direction at traditional Barceloneta, you can see what happened with the power of land subdivision and small properties. They were not asking each and every one of these property owners to resolve their parking demand on their own site by themselves, like it was a private matter on a private lot. They embraced the idea that parking and transportation generally is part of public infrastructure in a mature town. And that generated a wildly different result. So that idea of leveraging buildings that are big and small and the power of land subdivision and working within the grid is what they're doing in all your peer communities. South Downtown is the next place to watch in Atlanta, for example, or in Oklahoma City, not thought of as a hub of the arts. They have this Rainbow Row, which is is made it on the cover of a bunch of national magazines. All they had to do was buy paint. It's not that complicated. Actually, quite remarkable. That's called the Wheeler District. Because there was a guy named Wheeler that was one of the town founders, but also because one of the developers of this property called us up and said, by the way, I bought the Santa Monica Ferris wheel on eBay. It's been created and disassembled and created and shipped to Oklahoma. We're going to restore it and put it on this site. So the job is to first figure out where we're going to site that along the river, and then you can do your town thing. So that's been an interesting one to watch. But the way that's working out in Oklahoma City, where there are very few trees, it's very windy, it's very dry, the architecture has to actually make up for the fact that it is dry and windy. So small things can be powerful. And I loved all the old small things I saw here this week. And I just wish I could have seen more new small things to go with your new big things. And I wonder how that might be possible. For example, do you prohibit people from building around courtyards and building pocket neighborhoods on the fringes of downtown? It might be possible if you didn't have to build a separate yard for every dwelling to build something quite wonderful. So this method that I'm describing has actually been one that Americans have used for a long time. That's Montgomery, Alabama. The buildings are as good as the ones in the cast iron district in Manhattan. There's nothing about them that is inferior just because they were in Montgomery. And look at their plan. It's like yours. The collision of two grids requiring some diagonals and deflected vistas. They leveraged that. And they worked on the placemaking aspects of it. This was an important address in American history. That intersection in Dexter Avenue at Court Square is the intersection where at the telegraph office they sent the telegram to Charleston ordering them to fire on Fort Sumter and started the Civil War. It's also the spot where Rosa Parks caught the bus and became a key moment in the civil rights movement in the following century. And Dr. King's church was at the end of this street. So we knew we were in a very historic place. And so working on the restoration of a place with that much historical pressure upon it was pretty important. They didn't just do a roundabout and have it look like traffic engineering happened. They did a plaza that happens to have a round thing in the middle of it that looks like a piece of place. And so the last thing I'll say about the roundabouts, it is a very important medicine in the med kit for cities, but it's not the only one. And it should be used at the prescribed dosages, used only as directed. Don't overdose on it. And so when you do make a thing in the middle of the road, are you just resolving traffic and trying to make it safer, which is a good objective, or are you making a great address? This is Seven Dials in London, which has a thing in the middle of the road. People go out into the center of that and sit on the bench and watch the ballet of life go on around them. Can you imagine doing that at the roundabout out there? I don't think so. So there's just another way of making plans where you don't scrape everything off, but you assume that you will work with what's there and add to it. And that surgical approach is what cities are now doing in their downtown plans as a matter of routine. Richmond's plan, for example, those two colors, the brownish and reddish, are existing in proposed buildings. You see, it's not a matter of disrupting the grid and violating it and putting the building at a 45-degree angle just because we can, but instead adding in surgically to what's already there. This is the approach that will allow you to gradually and with a lot of different investors build a quality public realm. Here's an ordinary street in Paris. Here's an ordinary street in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Better or worse? My friend Vince Graham says, which would you rather eat, the rock or the jelly donut? The rock or the jelly donut? So that's where it leads me to the street design. And I'll go fast now, but I want to talk a little bit about the importance of that. The subtitle might be the most important, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. We wrote this big fat book because we became convinced that this was the one thing we could least afford to get wrong. And it was the one thing that is most often gotten wrong in cities. So it's kind of a subversive tool. It's also big and thick and heavy, so it works as a paperweight and a doorstop. But there are 500 pictures in it. The new edition will have like 650 pictures. And so hearing Dan talk about going to a meeting and opening the book and pointing to one of the streets and saying, can't we have a street like that in our town, was very gratifying to us as subversives. Let me say this about street design. Street design has always been a hallmark of advanced civilizations. Anybody recognize this street? This is the Appian Way, right? The Romans were really good at streets because for them, transportation and communications were synonyms. I would argue that our streets are still communications devices, sending messages all the time about what is important to you and how much you love your town. So Americans picked up on this. We positioned civic buildings in places of importance to lend dignity to those civic anchors or the institutions inside them, to tell people how important we thought they were. We also did very simple things. This is Stockholm. Somebody just drew 2 lines on a map and lined up the trees and planted them in a row. And then every year since, it's been giving this great gift. Took this picture in the winter, it was cold. I saw the cyclist coming toward me. So I took a knee and I got my camera lined up just right and I waited until he got just the right place in the picture. And as he got closer to me, I realized he was whistling. It was 5:15 in the afternoon. He was on his way home from work. He had a backpack. He was on his commute home from work. He was whistling. He was having the time of his life. He was having the best part of his day. So here's a challenge. How many people in Sarasota County that commute can say that their commute home after a stressful workday is the best part of their day? Not a bad goal. And by the way, the simple matter of lining up 2 lines on a map and spacing them off and planting trees in a row. Robert Stern says the first rule of design is line things up. Not that you always have to follow that rule, but at least you should be conscious about what you're doing. There's a piece of it right there, a block from here. But this inheritance that we have in street design is a very powerful thing. Our streets don't all have to look the same. That's not a Spanish street, it's a Spanish colonial street in Buenos Aires. But they put the Rambla in the middle, just like in Barcelona. So most of the pedestrian space is in the center of the right-of-way rather than on the fringes. Turns out there's a lot of flexibility in all these street types. And we can get an effect from doing a little design to it instead of just doing engineering. And one of those effects is that we can inspire reinvestment. This was a street that they decided not to disfigure, but to restore. And almost instantly, the owners of the historic buildings began restoring those. So the lower right-hand corner is a picture of the building as it stood a decade ago, falling down, and now it's all been restored. And part of that was because the city made a new commitment to that street. And they also restored the historic transportation system with the El Paso streetcar in that place. So I think this street-mindedness can help you rethink historic preservation as well. Maybe even go from treating historic preservation as a pure regulatory function to thinking of it as an economic development tool. And that would be really good. You, of course, have a lot of wonderment in the new and not so new buildings around town. But in street-mindedness, we don't just enjoy the object for all of its charm, we think about its context. And I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and risk that you'll never invite me back and say, your intersections are too big. A lot of the intersections are too big. And it's drowning out the music that building is making in our eyes. So I'll give you an example of people reversing that approach. In downtown West Palm Beach, Clematis Street has always been the main street. And at times they had bikes and cars parked in the middle of the street. It was always the main drag. When they began to try to compete unsuccessfully with the suburban shopping malls, they made it even wider and then wider again. And they kept pushing the pedestrians onto less and less of the real estate in that right-of-way, out on the fringes. They started blocking out the buildings so they didn't have any windows. That way they were more similar to the shopping malls they were competing with. They even made it one way at one point. So not that long ago, in my memory, Clematis Street was like a highway, and it was desolate. They fixed it. They turned that street back to a street that had one lane in each direction, had on-street parking and wider sidewalks and trees. The first round of this, about 1992, they did with all of the conventional engineering dimensions of the time. So the lanes were too wide, the trees were too few, the sidewalks were still too narrow. And as a result, it became quite a difficult place to walk and even more difficult to roll your wheelchair. But in the redesign, they got the dimensions right. They also got rid of the curbs, made it slower and safer and shaded, and got wide sidewalks and places for street trees. So this is the new Clematis Street, which has been redone just in the last few years. First in a small pilot phase, and then they expanded it. And you can kind of, from the aerial here, you can really see how much they downsized the car space. It still has on-street parking, just not as much. It still has a lane in each direction. The trolleys share that space along with the fire trucks and everybody. but they have a lot more space for the outdoor dining and for trees, and it really shows. People have flocked back to the space, and they feel comfortable. They do whatever feels right. They cross wherever they want to. Don't tell them I said that. Not necessarily at a marked crosswalk. If you look closely, the cyclist here is riding on the wrong side of the road. Because it is slow, it has really changed. And of course, at times they close the street and it becomes the social center of West Palm Beach. A lot was learned by doing that. And as we went from phase to phase after that pilot phase, it emboldened the people of downtown. So the merchants were asking for even less parking by the time we were done. We made some discoveries along the way. We found out that those retractable bollards were only about $300 more than the ones that were fixed and unmovable. So we started putting them on both sides of the parking spaces so that with the turn of a key in a couple seconds, we could convert a parking space to an outdoor dining space or a seating space or a food truck or a vendor. So that was the idea of the adaptable street. This was done partly because the owner of the coffee shop adjacent to here insisted that that had to be a parking space, absolutely positively. It's a coffee shop after all. The customers are used to pulling up, grabbing a coffee, and taking off. And he was adamant, that's my parking space. So we just put a bollard on each side that was retractable. And as soon as the ribbon was cut, they put the outdoor seating there, and it's never been used as a parking space ever since. During COVID, people had to get creative about taking the activities that are inside buildings and moving them outside, and that's what they did. They brought the cycle gym, the stationary bikes, out into the street, for example. And so West Palm has actually become a leader for the whole state on this business of organizing how and when to adapt the street to less traffic or more, or less parking or more. In street design, there is one thing that you cannot get wrong, and that is the design speed or the target speed of the street. Slow is beautiful, and fast speed kills. And here's the drama of that. If you are in a collision, we don't call them accidents, because if you engineer it knowing that that's going to happen, it's hard to call it an accident. But if you're in a collision between a car and a pedestrian and the car was going 20 miles an hour, then 5% of the time, 1 time out of 20, which is still too many, there will be a fatality. But if the car is going just a little bit faster, 30 miles per hour, then there will be a fatality 50% of the time. And at 40, 80% of the time, 45, 85% of the time, there will be a fatality. So just a little uptick in speed creates a big uptick in mayhem. So slow is beautiful. And I think that's been the key to every successful street retrofit. If you like Park Avenue in Winter Park, that was one of our earlier ones. The first thing was trying to get some coordination between the private development and the public street in their designs. That was important. And slow the street down was the key to that. So Park Avenue has turned out pretty well with those details. But then the grace notes. Remember I started with that ornament and the cupola and the steeple and those things. The grace notes for Park Avenue are really the entrance to Rollins College. So we did a lot of studies on ways that the monumental entrance to Rollins College campus at the end of Park Avenue could be done, ultimately settling on this one with the twin arches. And then that was built. So if you go to Park Avenue and you look south, the main street ends with a very noticeable edge to the Rollins campus. And that's their version of the grace notes. Now, I love to pass out keypad polling devices or have people vote on their smartphones and just ask questions, but I'll ask you to do it with a raise of hands. Think back to the conversations with your parents. Did they tell you about walking or biking to school? Yeah, how many of you? Okay, a lot. Yeah, let me guess, 5 miles in the snow, uphill both ways. Is that the way that's working? So this is a very common thing. We get an audience together in our age groups and about this size, we'll always get a similar response. So then the next question, as you might have guessed by now, is what about yourself? Think back to your own childhood. Did you ever walk and bike to school for some of the years, right? Okay. All right, fast forward to present day in your neighborhood. Do the kids in your family or your grandkids or the kids in your neighborhood, do they walk or bike to school? Okay. This is not to suggest that walking into school and neighborhood schools are the panacea that solves all problems, but I want to point out how dramatically, in just the course of 2 generations, we converted our relationship to streets. So this is to make you think, when you go out there to do your next protected bike lane, let's say, how good can you make it? I'll just do the before and after on that one again. This is a Coral Gables example. My son posed on the blue bike. In this case, it was nothing fancy. It's not even Sarasota grade, right? But could really make a difference on whether you felt inclined to move around by walking, biking, or even using transit. So this is Davidson, North Carolina. The lady in the green sweater, I talked to her. And she told me that those trees, she pointed to what were then saplings really, said, these trees are my lifeline. Because those trees are there, I get out of my house and I walk around my block and I get exercise every day. And I know my neighbors. And I know my neighbors' kids. And they expect to see me if I walk around. And if those trees weren't there, I'd be inside my house all day. So the little things like planting street trees can actually make a big difference. I ride my bike to work, which is not as long a distance as I used to ride, but it's a pretty good ride. And I'm like the lucky guy in Stockholm. That's the best part of my day. So I know it makes a difference because I have a tree-lined street I can ride down. Another goal for if you're designing for value and designing for mobility is to design for people to come together, their neighbors. This is the mayor of Washington Street in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania. You will always find him there, and he will tell you the news of the day. And look how the bench is positioned where it's not looking at the cars parked on the street or looking at the buildings, but rather it's perpendicular and looking up and down. This is no small thing. Susan Pinker reports, and there's a great TED Talk on this, that they studied one of the largest groups ever studied in public health and epidemiology. They asked these people from all over the country who were in middle age, all kinds of questions about themselves, their daily lives, their habits. And then they stored all that data and they waited 10 years. And they went back to see whose heart was still beating, who was still breathing. And guess what they found? Of course it made a difference if they stopped smoking or they were taking their blood pressure medicine or they were getting a little exercise. But the top factors were, did they have a strong social network? Did they have friends and family around and people who would check on them if they got sick or help them out? And even more important were the daily interactions with people that you don't even know, like the barista who made your coffee, who knows your name, Marty, latte, large, but you don't know theirs. Those interactions are the most important correlation with longevity. So all of this can be collapsed into a really pretty understandable formula. If you depend on the idea that every trip is a car trip and made by one person all by themselves every time for everything, you won't get a town. But if you can think, how can I make the car optional for at least some of the short trips? Make a short trip in a car or walk and bike and use transit. You don't have to do a lot. You have to connect the town. You have to put things closer together. You have to make it green, and you have to have doors and windows facing the street. You can add to that by planting street trees and planting more street trees. You can make it even better if you connect it to the region with your trail system. You can make it even better if you think about people that are not just on foot or in cars, but also those who are on e-bikes and scooters and so on. There's all kinds of technology, so it's always changing. So you have to be ready for flexible about that. But whatever is coming next, be thinking about it. You can make it even better if you don't start with parking, but rather you have just the right amount of parking, not too much. A lot of our cities are eaten with parking. You can make it better still if the workplaces have showers and secure bike parking. And you can make it even better if you focus your development around places that are well connected for transit. So what do you want to be when you grow up? If what you want to be is a place where people are less dependent on expensive cars and you're not eating the city with parking podiums, then you need to design car optional neighborhoods. And I will give Marty that list so you can see it. I want to end on public health. This guy will end up in an emergency room at some point. He will be diagnosed with dehydration or heat stroke or something. Someone will probably ask him, what were you thinking by even being out there? He actually has street tree deficiency syndrome. Yeah. We can fix that. Lee Health Authority board member said to me that the hospital, Lee Memorial Hospital, was in the medical repair business because they waited until people got sick and then they tried to fix them. So what they're trying to do is build a place where people can live well with wellness, live high quality lives, and in particular, come to know their neighbors and live outside and be encouraged to walk and bike. And that includes the expensive houses for the doctors and the anesthesiologists, and it includes the regular places for regular folks to all be part of the same thing. So I've given you a tease as to the kind of stuff we touch on in the new edition of the Street Design book, and that'll be coming out later this year. So I look forward to your questions about it. I don't want you to buy one. I want you to buy 100 of them and pass them out to all your members and friends. Thank you very much.
Here's a question.
Fast answers.
Does our Bayfront Drive qualify as a something spasm of concrete, and may that highway be relocated to make better use of the Bayfront?
So the good thing about these big pieces of infrastructure is that we do in fact rebuild them from time to time. They're at the minimum repaved and restriped and resurfaced, and then pipes and wires and things that are under them start to fail and we replace those as well. So once a generation or once every other generation, which isn't very long in architectural time, you will get an opportunity to make timely upgrades. That's exactly what happened in Clematis Street. It's exactly what happened in Park Avenue and Winter Park. It's exactly what's happening in Oakland and Syracuse. So I would say never to rethinking the big ugly infrastructure, because it could be value adding instead of subtracting.
Why? And this was, I think, reference to Chattanooga, but bringing it back to Sarasota. Why couldn't you start revitalization on, this was a question about Chattanooga. Why couldn't you restart it on Main Street? But more importantly, how about us? What does our Main Street possess that you think we should build upon? What's our low-hanging fruit?
Wow, there's a lot there. But okay. I think your Main Street is almost all right, as Robert Venturi famously said. And I tried to show with some pictures of it. There's magic in certain blocks and certain block faces where it all seems to be working. And you want to be careful when you go back to Main Street to update it, that you don't lose what's good about it, that you don't wreck what's already there. So like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And then, but plan on adding to it. Right now it's a really good Main Street. It's one of the best ones in Florida. You're right to love it. It could be one of the great world streets. There's nothing really keeping you from doing that. And I think that will come from the whole ensemble, getting the dimensions right, giving the right amount of the right of way to pedestrians and outdoor dining instead of squeezing those things in. And it will come from getting neighborly architecture as the norm. And I think you're blessed with its geometry. You're also cursed with its length, because it's very hard to support a continuous ground floor retail, great street for so many thousands of feet. Not that it can't be done. And Park Avenue in Winter Park is 3,000 feet long. There are long ones, but that's really hard, especially in an era when there will be less and less retail-led development. With retail in something of a spiral, we can't count on the ground floor uses or shopfront uses to be the economic driver for the redevelopment when buildings do age out and get replaced. So we have to plan on it being something else, and that means there's going to be a lot of that something else upstairs.
Well, great. Well, another round of applause for Victor.
Thank you all for having me.